Hi Ian, thank you for joining me on the podcast. How are you doing?
Good man, it's my pleasure. Football didn't come home, but never mind.
No, no, it didn't, did it? It was good. Did you watch it then?
Yeah, I did. It's funny. I'm a neutral. You know what I mean? I when I was at school, I played rugby. That's my sort of first love. However, you can't not be interested in the Euros. But as a neutral, I mean, firstly, it was frustrating to watch the initial games. I was as frustrated as anybody else was. And I actually thought that England turned up against Spain, and it wasn't a case of we lost it. They won it. They were the better team, and I think that from what little I know, if you want to be the best, then you have to beat the best, and we didn't.
Yeah, they were the better team on the day and the
Yeah,
whole
they were.
tournament.
They were, and they probably are. That said, I got a sense that 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 the that we ought to be enthusiastic about the World Cup. There's a lot of good stuff came out of the last couple of games, the Holland game and the Spain game. But again, I'm no fucking expert.
The players we've got, we should be doing well. But with South, now he's gone now, Southgate. But with him, we was like relying on individual moments, and it's not enough really to win a tournament.
That's what I understand. That's what I understand. It's again, I don't know enough about football, frankly, to have an opinion. But as a neutral, I thought we turned up. I thought it was a great game of football, the final, and the best team won, and that's how these things work, isn't it? But I do think there's a lot to look forward to in the World Cup, and bring it on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, you joined me again because the first interview we did, the audio wasn't any good. So I really appreciate you coming back on and taking the time out to do it again. It means a lot.
Good, that's my pleasure. I mean, it's good conversation. So it's a shame that it would have been a shame just to have left it. Now we couldn't make it work. So well worth making the extra effort, I think, Ethan. Let's see what we get, mate. Shall we?
Yeah.
I told you,
Hopefully.
I told you a pack of lies last time. Hopefully, I'll tell you. Hopefully, I'll tell you. Hopefully, I'll tell you the same lies this time.
Well, you've got a reissue of your book here. It looks different now with the reissue, but
Hold on a minute. Let me do the right thing.
yeah, there you go. There's the one now.
That's the one. It's a much better version. There's some additional writing in there, and it's just better. It's not massively different, but I have some amazing memorabilia, some of which has made its way into this copy that isn't on the any of the previous ones. So
It's a bit blurry. I'll put a photo on in case anybody can't see it,
all right, mate.
but yeah, yeah. Sorry, what was you saying about it then? There's
Yeah,
memorabilia in it.
there's some additional writing in there, and but actually, what's very cool is that I've got some fantastic memorabilia, as you would expect, and some of that memorabilia has made its way into the new edition, and it really adds value. At the end of the day, you can get there are three. It was printed in 96. It was then reprinted in 2016. So this is the third time that the publishers released it, and and this third iteration, the orange cover is the best way to think about it, is far and away the best of the three. And frankly, they all cost the same amount of money. So if you're going to buy one, buy this one. If you're going to buy one secondhand, then wait until this one comes secondhand. But it's definitely the best of the three, without a shadow of a doubt. So yeah. Anyway, it's back out.
Are you glad? Were you happy making a new one? Was it?
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's one of those things. I think anybody that engages in any kind of creative activity would probably agree that you very rarely finish anything. It's rather a case that you abandon it to a deadline, and that was true of the first book. I mean, I missed two deadlines simply because writing isn't easy. And so the chance to be able to go back to this and make some small changes, add a few little bits and pieces, pull that sort of those memorabilia elements and drop those into the book make it a much stronger piece, and I'm really pleased about it, because I don't think I get the chance to do it again. You know, I don't think it will be reissued again in my lifetime, quite frankly. And that said, then this version that exists at the moment, I'm much happier with than I was when it was first released all those years ago. So for me, as a as a creative process, fantastic. You know.
Well, as I showed, I've got the second reissue. It's a brilliant book. So I'm guessing with the new added stuff in it, it's even better.
It is, yeah, it is. If you enjoyed it the first time or the second time, then this is definitely the third iteration is the one to get, without a doubt, Ethan.
And Noel Gallagher said it's the best book written on Oasis.
He did. You know, when I bumped into him at the NME Awards, I think probably 2 years after the book was first released, and I hadn't seen him since we'd since we've been working together. And we had just enough time. He did a little solo slot, I think either at the beginning of the awards or the end, and we had time to have a beer together. And what was interesting was that the record label had tried to stop the book being released, and I figured then that everybody in the band was probably really sort of peed off about it as well. But actually, having met subsequently Bonehead and Noel, and a couple of the crew, you know, Phil Smith, Coyley, everybody turned around and said, you know, we'd rather you hadn't have written it, but it is a really good book, and it's a really fair account. But Noel went one step further that night at the NME Awards. He said, listen, he said, it's the best book about my band. Those were his words, about my band. He said, that's out there, and he said, and it's the truth. So quite frankly, although it got very well reviewed by the Sunday Times and by all sorts of other people, the NME described it as brilliant. That was the review that meant the most to me, without a shadow of a doubt, you know.
What I really like about the book is it's a small circle at that time in the band, and you show behind the scenes of what it was like in that small circle.
You talk about a small circle, and I think people would be surprised to learn just how small that circle was. When I started with them in late mid '94, there were 10 of us. Five of those 10 people were the band. So in actual fact, the road party consisted of the band, Maggie, Coyley, Phil Smith, Jason, and me. That was it. And we were sharing rooms.
Yeah, how did what was the room sharing like? Who shared with who?
Well, Bonehead shared with Tony. Gwigsy and Liam shared. I shared with Jason. Coyley shared with Phil Smith. Maggie had her own room for obvious reasons. And that then left another room. And of course, Noel was the one person in the band that always had his own room, you know. That's
a bit, I wasn't expecting Liam and Gwigsy to share a room. I thought it'd more be Liam and Bonehead or Gwigsy and Bonehead. But was that because of Tony Mccaroll that they shared like that? Or?
No, I don't. I honestly, I don't know, because at the point at which I came on board, the room sharing thing was already a thing. I have a feeling that before things went bad, you know, between with Tony particularly, never mind the bigger picture with Liam and Noel, but with Tony particularly, I think in the early days, before that was an issue, they were the natural kind of combos. You know, I think Liam and Gwigsy, they had a great deal in common from a sporting, you know, point of view. At one point when we were touring, when the band were in the studio recording What's the Story, we had a football match with Nigel Kennedy, the classical musician. He was in the same studio recording an album, and he challenged Oasis to a football match. And so we had this football match. The reason I tell the story is that both Liam and Gwigsy were fucking brilliant.
Really?
I went down and played. I'm a rugby player by birth and definition. I just caused carnage at the back. You know? I chopped the legs off Nigel Kennedy on 3 or 4 occasions. but Gwigsy and Liam were really, I mean, very, very talented footballers, both of them. And I think you know, nobody ever said to me the reason that Liam, you know, shares a room with Quigsy, but I suspect it was they had very common interests, you know.
Yeah, definitely.
And at that time, back in the day, probably Bonehead and well, there wouldn't have been any choice, right? Noel's getting his own room. That's the way it is. So what's left? Well, Bonehead, you got Tony. You got Tony, you got Bonehead. But they got along, you know.
Yeah, we'll get on to Tony more soon. But with the book, another thing that I like is you show like the grueling tour dates that they did, because some people think that Alan McGee saw them in Glasgow and they were mega stars, but you show how hard they actually worked for it.
They worked, yeah. You know, the media picks up on the fact that they played hard, but they worked hard. And I think one of the things you have to remember is that when there is heat around a band, then there is interest. And the heat around Oasis was global. And so on any given day, Japan would want to talk to them. Australia would want to talk to them. America would want to talk to them. And what you have to remember is that there are significant different time signatures in each of those countries. So often the promotional activity would start at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning in order to be talking to Japan or in order to be talking to one of the other countries around the world at a time that made sense to them. And then the other thing you have to remember is that when a band is beginning, all of the cards are held by the media. You want to get that space with the enemy. You want to get that space with whichever Japanese, you know, journal wants to speak to you. It's important to you as a band. As the band gets bigger and bigger and bigger, well, then you hold the cards. And when they come to you and say, we really want to do an interview with Noel, you turn around and say, not sure we want to do an interview with you. But in the early days, when somebody comes knocking and says, we want to give you the opportunity and a platform to speak, you say yes, you know.
You mentioned that it changed over the years. Like once they started getting more popular, the press wanted to speak to them and they would say like, we don't want to speak to you, but what was the relationship like with the press when you were there?
Initially it was a real novelty. You know, I mean, I remember going down and doing some stuff at MTV because MTV was still a big deal back then. And they were excited. Top of the Pops was exciting. You know, the first time they did Top of the Pops, the second time, every time, you know, it was a vibe. It was a buzz for them. And I think the same was true with interviews with the NME or interviews with any other, you know, musical kind of outlet, whether it was in the UK or anywhere else around the world. And if you stop and think about it, this is an opportunity for these guys to talk about themselves, you know, to talk about their, and I'm going to use, it's a slightly hippie word, but no less true for that. Talk about their art, you know, from Noel's point of view, he was talking about his art, you know, from Liam's point of view, he was talking about, you know, being the lead singer in the greatest rock and roll band in the world. And they were for 15 minutes, you know. I mean, they had that Andy Warhol 15 minutes.
You speak there about Noel talking about his art in the media, but when the papers are releasing stories about like other stuff they were doing that wasn't about the music, did that affect Noel?
Nope, not at all. I don't think. Listen, I never lived inside his head, but there was no visual evidence to suggest that anything that the media ever said impacted him at all. If there was ever criticism, then he would ignore it because he simply didn't believe it. If anybody critiqued the songwriting, and there were a few that suggested both that the songwriting was naive or that it was derivative, borrowed from the Beatles, borrowed from T-Rex. If anybody played those cards too heavily, Noel would just ignore it. You know, at the end of the day, I don't think there's an artist ever in rock and roll who hasn't borrowed from somewhere. The trick, I think, is who you borrow from and how you borrow, and whether you're able to create something that is completely fresh and completely new out of that borrowed material, which I don't think you can deny Noel was able to do. And of course, in part because of the way that those songs were interpreted and delivered, particularly by Liam.
Do you we'll get back onto Oasis, but I just want to talk more about you. When you started out in the music business, you first started working with Duran Duran.
I did, yeah, for about 48 hours. I got sacked, and they were right to sack me. I mean, getting to work in rock and roll, it's not an easy thing to do. There is a degree of good fortune involved. A lot of that is about being in the right place at the right time, or knowing the right person. I had served in the parachute regiment, and a very close friend of mine who I served alongside of, he had a twin brother who didn't join with him. So we're two twin brothers. One of them's in the parachute regiment. The other one is in Birmingham, and he's in Birmingham pushing boxes and doing whatever needs to be done for a band that nobody's heard of over there at the time. Anyway, that band was Duran Duran. They became almost overnight the biggest band in the world. And Simon Cook was the twin who had stayed out and was working with Duran. He became head of their security organization because he was a European full contact Lao Gar Kung Fu champion, as was his twin brother, who I was serving alongside of in the parachute regiment. So Simon, when Duran became big, reached out to his twin and said, I need help. Leave the parachute regiment, come and work with me. Duran got bigger again. And then Simon and Viv reached back to me and said, you need to leave the parachute regiment because we need help. And so I ended up working with Duran Duran, but I wasn't ready for it. Culturally, I was still a hairy-ass paratrooper. and basically, I shot a complete Robin in Paris. It was a birthday party for Nick Rhodes, and Mick Jagger was there, Sting was there, Ronnie Wood was there, Bob Geldof was there, Grace Jones was there, all of Duran were there, all the beautiful people of Paris were there, and me, right? And I thought it was, part of our job that night. So there was Simon, Viv, and I. We had 3 brand new Jaguar XJ6 motor cars, and we were driving. Rather than using chauffeurs, we were driving the band and their guests from club to bar to club to bar throughout the course of the night. And anyway, I'm sitting behind Simon in my shiny steel grey Jaguar. And Simon's got, if memory serves, I think he had Ronnie Wood's wife, maybe Nick Rhodes' wife. I had Nick, I had Roger Taylor from Duran. I think Grace Jones was in my car. Anyway, I thought it'd be hilarious if I kind of sneaked up behind Simon's car at a junction and just pushed it ever so gently into oncoming traffic, right? And then stopping at just the right time. But it was a manual car, and my foot slipped on the clutch, and I pinged into the back of Simon's Jag. And it was basically it was like a road traffic collision. And I sent him maybe 15 feet into oncoming traffic, you know what I mean? I nearly killed them all. You can imagine all the rock and roll stars in Simon's car spin round to take a look at me. And all I had was just manic laughter, And so they must have thought I was fucking deranged. Anyway, the long story short is that the next morning, Simon called me into his hotel room, and he said, Rob, I've got a bit of bad news for you, mate. He said, I've got a flight ticket for you. He said, you've got to go home. You've just failed. You just failed the world's most relaxed interview process.
They didn't see the funny side, though.
Did he see the funny side? No, I think he felt pretty bad, actually. Because if you think about it, I'd left the parachute regiment. So I'd made this decision to stop doing what I was doing and what I was, building a career out of, and sort of leap sideways into rock and roll. And within 48 hours, I was unemployed, I mean, they were right. I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready. I didn't know how to do the job. And I just didn't have the I didn't have the tools at that point to learn how to do the job quickly enough, or to pay attention to what was required. I mean, there's no two ways about it. You know, I have no axe to grind with the Duran crew. They made absolutely the right decision. You know, Simon employed a moron. They sacked them.
You worked with numerous bands before you worked with Oasis. Who was your favourite to work with?
This is interesting. When I worked with Johnny Rotten, I worked with George Harrison, I worked with a lot of the blues artists, you know, John Lee Hooker, Buddy Guy, B.B. King. But in all of that, I think the band that I enjoyed, even now looking backwards, the band that I enjoyed working with the most, and this might come as a surprise, was a Leeds band called the Sisters of Mercy, because contrary to popular opinion, although they have this kind of goth tag, we had such fun, you know. And Eldritch, who is the kind of lead protagonist within the Sisters, always has been. He's super bright and a really funny guy. And I went around the world with, you know, and it was a gas. It was an absolute gas.
From like what you'd heard about bands before you worked with them, like in the press or word of mouth, is there any band that took you by surprise that were different than what you're expecting?
No, I don't think. Honestly, I don't think that there ever was. I mean, you know, I worked with Zig Zig Sputnik. They were exactly as you would expect, right? Complete and utter lunacy. Lydon, you know, maybe Rotten. You know, Rotten is a really smart cookie. And I tell you, I think it's very interesting, because when Liam started out, there were a lot of comparisons, weren't there, between Liam and Rotten? And I think they're fair, actually, even to the degree that you know, Johnny Rotten has become a national treasure, and who would have thought that in the days of the Pistols, right? And Liam has become a national treasure, and frankly, who would have thought that in '94 and '95? So I think there are similarities. Rotten is A, very bright, and B, and this is the thing that perhaps comes as a surprise, he's very compassionate. He's a very kind person, you know. I mean, I two Rotten stories, both of which are terrific. You know, one of them was we're up in Glasgow playing the Barrowlands. And I was driving Rotten and Rotten's manager, and Trigger, who was the band's production manager, Public Image Limited's production manager, drove the band. And Rotten and I got up there with his manager on time, and Trigger decided, or somebody decided for Trigger, that the rest of the band would stop off and get on the piss. So they arrived late and missed the sound check. So Rotten was really not in a good place. He takes the whole business of putting on a show very, very seriously. He was furious that his band had taken it less seriously. Anyway, at one point during the afternoon, he'd wandered off. He'd said to me, Rob, I'm going to just slip away for a couple of hours. And he slipped away and he came back. And he and I were sitting in the dressing room having a conversation. And the conversation we had, and it was like the conversation that you and I were having now, you know, just very relaxed. He said, I've just been to a pub, he said, around the corner. He said, dodgy little place. He said, very, very blue collar, very working class, spit and sawdust, full of an elderly group of men who life has not been kind to. Most of them are redundant now, you know. He said, and everybody in that bar wanted to buy me a drink and knew who I was. And he said, and it brought home to me just exactly what the Pistols brought to that kind of working class, disenfranchised world. And he said, it really made me think. So we're having this incredibly articulate conversation at the same level as I'm talking to you now. The promoter walks into the dressing room, okay? And Lydon from nowhere leaps up. He's got a bottle of beer in his hand and he starts, you fucking this, you fucking that, this wasn't this, that wasn't that, picks the glass up, fucking hurls it across the dressing room, misses the promoter deliberately, I suspect, explodes against the back of the room. The promoter shits himself and runs out of the dressing room. Lydon opens another bottle of beer, sits himself down, and he looks at me and he says, "Well, Robbo, they expect it of me." So it was a game to him. He was so in control of situation and circumstance, and he's a kind guy. When I had to stop working for the band, we were due to go to Brazil, and my grandmother was extremely ill, and it looked very unlikely that she would survive long enough for me to see her at the end of that Brazilian trip. So I said to Rotten, I said, "Listen, I'm really sorry." I said, I can't do Brazil. I said, "My grandmother's going to pass away probably in the next sort of 4 or 5 days, and I kind of need to be here." And I said, "I'm really sorry to let you down." Lydon said, "You are not letting me down. You've never let me down. Family first. Now fuck off and say goodbye to your grandmother properly." He's a really good guy. And I suspect Liam is, he's not following in Lydon's footsteps. He's creating his own path. But I suspect from everything that I see, as regards Liam in 2024, he's become a very similarly family-oriented, really decent guy, and at the same time remaining true to himself and to his values, which is something that Lydon has always been able to do, if we discount the fairly sketchy butter advert. You know what I mean?
You mentioned a lot of names there that you worked with. My favourite from that bunch was George Harrison. What was he like?
Well, your favourite is George Harrison. Yeah, maybe. Mine was the Sisters. George was amazing. Of course, I worked with George well after the Beatles. And so he was a fully formed and very humble human being. And to give you some idea of how humble he was, we were doing a show at the Albert Hall, and Gary Moore was playing with him, or George was playing with Gary. Anyway, the Albert Hall, there are 2 main dressing rooms, stage left and right, and then a series of other dressing rooms kind of behind and off the stage, but right close to the stage there are 2 dressing rooms that the headline artists will always use. So Gary had one, George had the other, and I was following George, and he didn't know I was following him, through the Albert Hall and down to his dressing room. So I'm behind him, and he doesn't know. We're just going, I'm not actually following him. We're just going we're going in the same direction, He gets to his dressing room, and this is the first time he's arrived at the dressing room. And on the dressing room, the promoter's got his name and a great big gold star. And George shakes his head, still doesn't know I'm behind him, peels the gold star from the dressing room and screws it up, turns around and catches my eye. And he just says, "Robbo, it is so unnecessary. We're all stars, even you." And he gives me the screwed up gold star. He says, "Just find a bin for it, would you?" You know what I mean? Very, very humble guy. Very, very humble guy. And when you consider, everything that he'd achieved, both as a musician and actually, I would argue, as a human being. I mean, you look at handmade films. Things like The Life of Brian would never have been made without George Harrison. And the story is that the reason he put up the money, remortgaging his house in order to do that, was simply because he wanted to see the film. He'd read the script. He wanted to see the film. A good egg. So it was a gas to work with George because George is George. And to watch him close up in performance was a great privilege. And it was all a great privilege. I mean, this is the thing that I was, as a kid, I was a fan. It's kind of weird that I ended up in the parachute regiment. When I was 12, 13 years old, I was listening to Bowie and Bolan and Roxy and the Stones, Mick Taylor era Stones, untouchable in my book. And I was a proper cool little kid, you know what I mean? And yet somehow I ended up in the parachute regiment. But then to be given the opportunity as a fan, and I'd always been a fan, and I remained a fan, even when I was jumping out of airplanes and blowing stuff up, to then have the chance to work in that world with some of the most extraordinary talents of the 20th and you could argue 21st century was an incredible privilege. Certainly Oasis, I certainly the you know, having those early years of Oasis was a great gift, I think.
That comes across in the book that you were also a fan as well as working professionally.
Yeah, no doubt, and I still am. You know, I still am. I still do a bit. I mentor an artist called Alex Lipinski, and here's one for your listeners. He's if you dig Oasis and the whole kind of Britpop thing, and Weller and people like sort of Neil Young, then check out Alex Lipinski. Very, very talented. And I still do a bit of tour management. I went out at the back end of last year with Mark Almond and Neil X. Mark has a little side hustle called The Loveless. And it's basically Mark and Neil and Iggy Pop's rhythm section. And we did like a handful of shows towards Christmas up and down the country. So, you know, if you ask me nicely, I'll still go out and do a bit of tour management, but it has to be a very kind of, it has to be the right people, and it has to be a fairly limited schedule of engagements. I'm really not interested in another 2 years on the road, you know? But the right artist under the right terms and conditions, yeah, still up for it.
Yeah, definitely. Well, back onto Oasis, you started working with them in 1994 after their incident at the incident at the gig in Newcastle when Noel got punched on stage. Can you remember getting the phone call?
Yeah, I can. I met them first in New York, and Marcus Russell was already a friend of mine. I knew Marcus through some mutual friends when he was looking after Johnny Marr, looking after the. So we knew each other, and we knew each other quite well. I was in New York at the same time, and I was actually at the same gig that Oasis were doing at a place called the Wetlands on the Lower West Side of Manhattan Island. And it was part of a thing called the New Music Seminar. It was a showcase for the band and other bands. And it was a tiny, you know, they played in a tiny venue. The band I was there with were ex-CNN, who are brilliant. Another band worth looking out and listening to. Album called Tin Star. Terrific. Anyway, so I'm there with ex-CNN, and I see Oasis for the first time in a shitty little spit and sawdust club, as I say, Wetlands, Lower West Side, Manhattan, and they're just electrifying in that small space. You know, they are incredible. Now, obviously, I'm aware of them because at that point. I think Shaker Maker and Supersonic have both already been released, you know, but and there's a buzz, but it hasn't gone nuts. Certainly not in America, you know. And I see, without a shadow of a doubt, that there is something truly special about the band. And then, just through coincidence, we're staying in the same hotel, and so myself and Marcus and Bonehead. And I think Gwigsy got together, and we were having a couple of beers, and just, you know, Marcus introduced me to Bonehead and Gwigsy. We're chatting, and I said to Marcus, "Listen, I thought the show was extraordinary, and I'd love to work with the band." I said, "I know you can't afford me, but when you can, then please, you know, give me a call." And I said, "And I don't care what I do." I said, "I'm tour managing at the moment, so technically security would be a step backwards. But if that's the opening that creates itself, then I'll more than happily take it, because, you know, I want to be in your gang is the essence of it." And then, as you say, literally maybe 2 weeks later, I saw on the news and across the radio that in Newcastle, somebody had managed to get on the stage and punch Noel in the face. And I thought, my phone's going to ring. and sure enough, the next day my phone rang, and it was Marcus, and he said, "Right, okay, you know, we need you on board. You know, can you come and meet the guys and be interviewed for the job?" I said, "Yeah, I would absolutely love to."
Did you know about Oasis's reputation when you took on the job?
Well, you know, here's what I knew. I knew that the media was drawing a picture, and I knew that the media had decided where the stories lay, and that those were the stories that they were going to tell. I'd had conversations with Marcus, and Marcus's take on it was, you know, this is a band that are enjoying all of the opportunities to press the fun button that being in a rock and roll band that's achieving a bit of success and getting a bit of interest are going to get. And what's wrong with that? And I agree. You know, I mean, a lot of the bands that I'd worked with, Bananarama, right? Believe it or not, they pressed the fun button every bit as hard as Oasis ever did. Spandau Ballet, Duran. You know, it is no great surprise that rock and roll bands stay out late, drink, smoke, and take drugs, right? There's nothing new in that. So I wasn't surprised. There was nothing surprising. The intensity of it was a challenge, definitely. But you know, they were just a proper rock and roll band, being proper rock and roll stars. And, you know, more power to them for that. That's just a, you know, there aren't enough proper rock and roll stars these days. And I suspect, you know, Oasis were the last great analog rock and roll band.
Yeah, there's not many, is there, since then at all?
No, there aren't. You know, I mean, there's, you know, who's to say that Radiohead are not a rock and roll band? They absolutely are. But analog, that kind of purist, you know, guitars oriented, conventional, for want of a better word, not boring, not dull, not grey, not vanilla, but conventional. You know what I mean? The Oasis never reinvented the wheel in the way that Tom York does, in the way that REM were able to do. You know, they were easy to understand, and they were just a brilliant analog rock and roll band. And again, for want of sounding like a broken record, the last great analog rock and roll band.
Speaking of the rock and roll and the whole thing that comes with that, Liam and Noel are well known for fighting each other and arguing with each other. Did you see that a lot when you were working?
Yeah, I did. I mean, and right from the beginning, I think day one, actually. Day one, the interview took place at the Astoria Theatre, closed now, unfortunately. And in catering, they were kicking off, you know, with each other. What changed, though? Their arguments in the early days were stupid brother sibling stuff. You know, I mean, that argument in that catering room on that day, I can still remember, was actually about whether or not Lennon would still be valid if he was alive in 1994. Okay. Not the kind of thing that you would imagine anybody could get terribly excited about, but they did. And so, and it came and it went, you know what I mean? And as quickly as it came, it went, and it didn't carry over. There was no anger, particularly that sort of festered. As we moved through, and as the attention became greater, as their success built, as the pressures built, as they got busier and perhaps too busy, those disagreements became harder to ignore, and they lasted longer. But in my opinion, what changed everything was the Barrowlands show, where Liam lost his voice for the first time, and Noel decided that he would continue the show without Liam and just deliver those songs to the best of his ability with him performing the vocal. And he really enjoyed that. And from that day forward, the band then made sure that at every show, there would be a Noel interlude. And then it stopped being brother to brother, and it became more of a power struggle. I think Liam particularly felt threatened in his position as the unchallenged front person, singer for the band. You know, the balance was perfect when they had that kind of Pete Townsend, Roger Daltrey vibe. Pete writes the songs, Roger delivers them, and actually right up until it didn't matter, you know, Pete wasn't trotting out his own atonal vocals. You know, that didn't happen until way down the line. Certainly not in those very early days. The same days that the Who went through that early success. It was Roger Daltrey was the singer, Pete Townsend was the guitar player. Yes, he wrote the songs, but live, that was how it worked. And undoubtedly, when Noel started taking a position on stage as a singer and holding the spotlight, that's when brotherly arguments became more of a power struggle. And in those early days, it just became more and more intense. It just became more and more intense, and the distance between them became wider, and the moments where they came together with the same joy that had been the case at one point again became fewer and further between. And then you had two camps, and when you have two camps, you have two groups of hangers-on, for want of a better word, blowing smoke off each other's arse. So in Liam's camp, they'd be going, "You're the genius," and in Noel's camp, they go, "You're the genius," and that just, you see it in a lot of rock and roll bands, you know. But it started as early as late '94, which was when the Barrowland show took place, and then it was just, frankly, in my opinion, that was the end. That really? Night was the end of the band. It just took 15 years or whatever it was in order for it to play itself out. But it was all that was written in the stars that night.
Liam does say, I think it was the Supersonic documentary, actually, like, if you're writing the songs, playing guitar and singing them, like, what am I meant to be doing?
Yeah. I mean, I can't speak for what goes on inside Liam's head, or for what went on inside Liam's head. Certainly not back in '94 and '95. But let's just imagine you're a young man, and all of your dreams are coming true, and just about everybody around you is pissing in your ear and telling you that you are a genius. Eventually, you start to believe that stuff, you know, and then it kind of changes where your head is at. And then, you know, and this is where I come from in respect to power struggle. Noel encroaches on what Liam sees to be his territory. You know, he completely understands that Noel is the genius songwriter, but he rightly believes that without his contribution to the band, and I think, by the way, that in those early days, if Oasis did not have Liam, they would not have enjoyed the success. Liam was the sex in the band, basically. And actually, he was the danger in the rock and roll as well. And you have to have both of those things. You have to have, you know, if you have the genius and the songwriting, that's terrific. But if you then don't have an element of uncertainty and danger and darkness, arguably, because this is rock and roll, not pop, and you don't have the sex, then you're probably not going to become the Rolling Stones, REM, U2. You know what I mean? You need all of those ingredients, and Liam provided a real chunk of what was important, without a shadow of a doubt. And without him, I'm confident they would have done well, because nobody was writing songs with the same kind of quality that Noel was. But we wouldn't be talking about them the way we are talking about them now in 2024, 30 years down the line, had Liam not been a part of that band.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying there. And like you mentioned, with him singing, that kind of caused arguments as well. But do you think touring with each other so much and living in each other's pockets, that can cause a lot of fallout?
I mean, that's a no-brainer, isn't it? Yes. But the kind of fallout that creates, you mitigate against as the band has success, because in '95 we weren't sharing rooms anymore, so you create that little bit of space and that little bit of extra comfort. In fact, that's what Marcus said to me, the band were in the States, and it was after I'd been employed by them. I'd got the gig at the Astoria. They then went to America, but they couldn't afford to take me. And Marcus said, "You'll pick it up when they come back." That was the point, and the tour where at the Whiskey it all went south and Noel disappeared. You know, literally just disappeared. And as a result of that happening, Marcus picked up the phone and said, "When they get back, Robert, we need to give them a flavor and a taste of some of the rewards that this success is going to bring. We need to put them in better hotels. We need to give them their own hotel rooms. They need to see and enjoy some of the fruits of that labor." And so, although we were working still very, very hard, the tour buses got better, the hotels got better, we created space and were able to create space. And so, yeah, you're living in each other's pocket, but there were places that you could go and hide, if you like. So I don't think it was ever really about the pressure of life on the road. I think that in isolation they would have been able to deal with over the years. I genuinely think it was this power struggle. It was this sense of who does what, and it was territorial. You know, to what was the Kurt Cobain phrase? Territorial pissing, right? is fundamentally what it came down to, and that began that night at the Barrowlands in '94, which is why I would argue that as long ago as November, I think, maybe December in '94, the band were finished.
Crazy,
it just took a long time, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's a relationship, and maybe it's no different to a marriage. You know, I can think of friends of mine whose marriage is ostensibly finished on this day, but actually it took 20 years, right, for it to get from that day where that's it, it's done. There's no coming back from that place, but actually it took 20 years for those two people to part company.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
And this is the other thing about, you know, people ask me, and I don't know why, you know, my knowledge of the band is really exclusively around those early days, and it's pretty accurate, right? I mean, but people ask me, do I think that the band will get back together again? And you know, my response to that is, well, listen, the men that I knew then are not the men that are out there in the universe now. And frankly, if you really want to know what's in Noel's head, what's in Liam's head, you'd be better off asking Pep Guardiola, right?
Yeah.
Or any member of the Manchester United first team squad.
Man City.
Man City, Christ, yeah. Shit. Yeah.
Saved you there.
Yeah, that was shaking ground. There you go. See, I told you football about football. Yeah, you know, and the other, and back to that kind of two groups. Be careful what you wish for, because if they do go back out, I don't think they will, but if they do go back out on the road, it will look like this, right? Noel will have his own entourage and management and tour bus. Liam will have his own entourage and tour management and tour bus. And each of those individual management structures will have a different way of doing business and a different agenda for the tour and a different set of priorities. Then you got to cross the bridge of, well, which iteration of Oasis is getting back together?
Yeah.
Right? And from where I'm sitting, there are only two answers that make any sense in terms of integrity and attaching yourself to what really mattered. So it has to be Wigsy, Bonehead, and either Tony Mccaroll or Alan White.
Yeah, I agree.
Right? That is the only iteration of that band that really makes sense if they're going to go, let's do it all again. Let's take it back. Well, take it back, and take it back to those days of anger, those days of discovery, those days when all of their dreams were coming true, and but they didn't know it. You know, there's a lot made and written about the certainty of their success in those early days, and about how confident they were in that success. And I can tell you from being around them in those early days, they were confident, but it was as big a surprise to them, the speed at which things happened, as it was to the people reporting it. Okay, it was as big a surprise to the record label. It was as big a surprise to Marcus. It was as big a surprise to Liam and to Noel that these things happened as quickly as they happened, that it fell together as quickly as it fell together. And it was fascinating. One of the most fascinating things is we come back to they were a global band, but they developed at a different pace in different territories. So actually, I think the first country that really nailed them on as superstars was Japan. Before the UK. The UK then came in close, close second. Places like Germany were, we were looking at the transition from clubs to theatres to arenas in the UK at the same time as which playing to tiny clubs in Europe, at the same time as which I remember a gig in Salt Lake City and we played to 6 people. Noel actually sat outside the club busking, okay, at something that is inconceivable today. But he sat outside the club busking for most of the afternoon. Nobody was interested, and I think he made $1.84, right?
Jeez.
So there's this kind of, Japan's nailed on, the UK is beginning to wake up, the States is way behind, Europe is way behind again. It's a really interesting dynamic. Because from the point of view of most people, I suspect, watching this podcast, their memory will be what happened in the UK. But this was a global thing, and we had very different experiences in different countries.
You mentioned that it was slow builder, but when was the moment when you knew these are going to be a big band?
For me, we did some shows with REM. We supported REM across, I think it was 4 shows. One of those shows was at Slane Castle, which is just outside Dublin. And REM were headlining. I'm pretty certain that we were the bottom of the bill. And so I think the capacity at Slane, 60, 70, 80,000 people. We helicoptered in early. So there's 2 things. Firstly, we're helicoptering anywhere, right? So something's happening when the record label's spinning for a helicopter for you. But then as we came into Slane, and we came in early, my expectation from experience is that you're the bottom band on the bill, okay, for REM, and your audience demographic there's a crossover, but it's by no means identical, And so my expectation as we helicoptered in was that there might be 10, 15, maybe 20,000 people there who wanted to get there early enough to watch Oasis. There was somewhere between 40 and 50,000 people there as we came in. And that was the point where I thought, okay, this is really taking a turn, because those people would have come here even if REM weren't on the bill. Those people would have bought a ticket to see Oasis. And then during the course of the show, the security was so unaware of what they were about to experience when Oasis hit the stage, the weight of expectation and crush and energy and desire to get closer to Liam, to Noel, to Bonehead, to Gwigsy, I think to REM, it's probably Alan. I had to take the band off stage, I think 4 times, because it was just, somebody was going to get killed out there. And that was the day when I said, this is going to go fucking crazy. This is going to be huge.
Jesus. You can't imagine it, can you?
Well, I can, because I was there,
No, I mean, from a fan perspective.
But it was, and again, this comes back to being a fan, And another thing, you know, so a lot of the memorabilia that I took away, I've given away. And people are like, well, why? Why did you give? Well, it's a piece of stuff. And actually, the only thing that's really important is not that bit of paper or that tour itinerary or poster. It's the memory. It's the being there. You know.
Yeah.
And again, as a kid that absolutely was a nailed on, you know, rock and roll fan that bought records the day they came out from the artists that I loved, you know, growing up with, to then be a part of that journey and to watch it from the very center, you know, of the hurricane, tornado, whatever the fuck it is that has a center, whichever weather front it is that has a center, tornado, I think. It was, you know, that's again, you know, I talk about privilege, I talk about gifts, both of those things.
Yeah. I bet, yeah, some amazing, amazing memories. I just want, we mentioned him before, but I want to talk about Tony Mccaroll because you were really the only person he got on with at that time, wasn't you?
Well, yes and no. Bonehead, I have to say, from the perspective of the band, and of course they were sharing rooms. Bonehead had the time to be kind to Tony in a way that the rest of the band, I have to say, were not. And actually, neither were the crew. Jason, not really. Jason was not in any way malicious, but what surprised and shocked me was that it wasn't just Noel and Liam and to a degree Guigsy, but it was Coyley and Phil Smith who were very, very dismissive of Tony. And there's an interesting relationship dynamic there. You know, generally speaking, there's a hierarchy, band, crew, what you will, you know. But actually, because Coyley and Phil Smith had been around for so long, there wasn't much of a line between the band and between them in terms of whose opinion was important. And they were, I would say, Coyley led the charge. Probably began the conversation that ended in Tony leaving the band. Having said that, there is no doubt in my mind that Noel, of course, made that decision, but he made that decision from a place of truth, being genuinely convinced that Tony was not the drummer to play in the band that Noel could see and desired Oasis to become. Noel knew, because Noel was then already writing the songs that would become What's the Story, that there was an additional degree of complexity that he was looking for. I mean, he wasn't writing, stuff that wouldn't look out of place on a Frank Zappa album, but nonetheless, there's a shift in complexity between Definitely Maybe and What's the Story, and Noel was confident that Tony just didn't have the goods to be the drummer in the band that Noel saw Oasis becoming, and he was given every opportunity. He was encouraged to take lessons, and he did. He had lessons. But it never came together. I'm not sufficiently talented musically to have a point of view as to whether he wasn't, or ever could have been. But Noel is, and the decision, as challenging as it is, and I think it is challenging. I think as soon as a band starts sacking original members, you're getting into a very, very wobbly space. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Culturally, morally, ethically, and for me. When Bonehead and Guigsy were no longer a part of it, I'm like, whoa, that's you're not a band anymore.
You're a different band, then, aren't
you?
You
Know, I don't even think you're a band anymore. I think it's the Liam and Noel show with some hangers on, with some hired guns. And I don't care how good or not good or that they might be as musicians. It's not. It says Oasis on the tin, but it's not.
Yeah, I agree. I do like Andy Bell again, but I know what you mean. Once you getting rid of these original people.
But you've got to, questions need to be asked really as to, you know, as to, because that energy, that gang, it's gone.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's a truthfulness that goes then as well, actually. And you know, you show me anybody that will argue that any of their records post Definitely Maybe are as good as Definitely Maybe or What's the Story.
None of them are.
I mean, that's just the truth.
Yeah, yeah.
That's just the truth. You know.
But
having said that, two of the greatest rock and roll albums of all time. And,
oh yeah.
And that's no small achievement. You know, they were the last great analog rock and roll band, and they were the greatest rock and roll band in the world for 15 minutes. You know, I would argue it was the 15 minutes that I got to spend with them.
You mentioned there though, What's the Story, Morning Glory. You were actually on the tour bus when Noel played it to the rest of the band on an acoustic guitar.
Yeah, he'd been writing them, and actually, as he got more and more wrapped up in the songwriting, we saw less and less of him. So at the end of a show, if there was a party or a club or a this or a that, very often Noel wouldn't go. Very often Noel would just finish whatever it was we were doing that day, and he'd get back to his hotel room and he'd just write. You know, he'd just sit there with him and whatever his muse is, and you know, an Epiphone acoustic, and he would write. Anyway, at some point, I guess he felt that he had the album pretty much, and we were in Germany. We'd done a gig. I think we were in Hamburg. We were in Hamburg, and we gigged in Hamburg, and we were taking the bus back to the hotel. And Noel decided that he would share with everybody on the bus where he got to, which is to say the songs were pretty much finished, but the lyrics weren't. And he played the whole of what was eventually What's the Story on an acoustic guitar, humming when the lyrics weren't fully formed. You know, I haven't quite, you know. And at the end of it, Bonehead was in tears and insisted that he played through it again. So we started as we left the venue. We got to the hotel. Nobody got off the bus. Nobody would let Noel stop. He finished, and then he went through the album from start to finish a second time. And I guess we finally came off the bus 3 o'clock in the morning, maybe, you know, having been the first people anywhere to hear those songs, you know, without the benefit of a drummer, without the benefit of any arrangement or strings or Liam's vocal, you know, just Noel saying, stripped down, about as stripped back as you could possibly imagine. And even then, and even in that context, you could, you know, the melody, you just knew this was going to be an absolute belter.
Yeah, I was going to ask that. Like, obviously, there's only an acoustic guitar and Noel singing them. But did you feel like it was going to be a massive album?
Absolutely, absolutely. What I felt like was that that they were going to keep the promise. If you like, Definitely Maybe, and their live energy at that time was a promise. They made a promise to the world, and then they kept that promise with What's the Story, and that's a really hard thing to do.
Yeah, it's crazy because it's a different album to Definitely Maybe. Obviously, like it took a different route, but it's still the pure energy in it.
The energy is still there, you know. And for me, I prefer What's the Story, but I understand that there is a school of thought that says Definitely Maybe was Oasis at their best, and you know, it's one of those. Nobody's right, nobody's wrong.
What's your favourite memory when you look back at your time working with Oasis?
I mean, there's no moment, but maybe there is actually. I've got a photograph. I've got a photograph of the band in the studios with Gered Mankiewicz, who's a brilliant rock and roll photographer. He's photographed Dylan, the Stones, Hendrix, you know, and he was doing a shoot with the boys, and I have a photograph of the band in his studio being photographed by Gered Mankiewicz, and they're off duty, and Noel has said something, right, and clearly it's the funniest thing anybody's ever said, and I just capture that group of people in that moment, and on each and every one of them, it's just pure joy. And there was a phase where it was just pure joy, where the balance between the workload and the reward in terms of an enthusiasm to do the press, an enthusiasm to do the TV, and their dreams beginning to come true, the truthfulness of it all. And for maybe 3 or 4 months, it was probably about as perfect a place as you would want to be in any rock and roll band's journey. And that photograph captured the mood of that time. So if I have to put my finger on a single moment, then that would probably be it, because it's been captured. But anything in and around that 2 or 3 months, you could pick and go, yeah, you know. Yeah, I remember we were staying at the hotel off Primrose Hill, Marriott, and Roll With It is just about to be released. Hasn't been released. It's just about to be released, and it's maybe 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. And that hotel, the Marriott, it's got like a flat roof and arches, and Liam managed to get out onto that flat roof, right? 3 o'clock in the morning, and he is singing at the top of his voice, Roll With It, you know what I mean? Waking up every single person at the front of the hotel, managers kicking off, and it was just great fun. You know what I mean? It was just great fun. I would say that period leading up to the release of What's the Story was magical, absolutely magical.
What did you mentioned their role with it, and that was in competition with Country House by Blur. What did you make of the whole Blur Oasis?
It was manufactured largely. Whenever those two bands came together, even at the height of all of that, they got along just fine. You know, maybe they weren't best friends. They've become, I think, very good friends with the passing of time, because they shared an experience that is unique, that very few people will be able to relate to and understand, right? But I remember we were in Tokyo, and Marcus was writing a letter to Blur's management, just going, you know, we really, as management of these two respective bands, we really ought to not allow this to get to kind of blow up out of all proportion, because there's some tribal elements here that are not good. You know, you're getting into mods and rockers territory, and some kid's going to get hurt. I mean, they were looking at it from that kind of point of view. So it was never as big a thing to the band, or probably to the bands. I can't speak quite as authoritatively about what was happening in the Blur camp, but certainly in the Oasis camp, we didn't take any of it too seriously. Did we want to be number one? Absolutely. You know, the only thing I would say is that if you look back, Oasis released a single iteration of that. Okay, it came out in one format and one format only. Blur released about 3. Each one of those formats counts as a sale towards the chart. So certain fans would buy all 3. That same Oasis fan can only buy 1. And the numbers, when they came in, they didn't beat us by that much. And I remember Liam being very disappointed. And I thought to myself, no, that the truth will out when the albums come. And I said to Liam, I said, listen, I said, you may have lost the battle, but you are going to win the war. And that was the case, right?
Yeah, definitely.
That was the case.
I don't know how true it was, but apparently the barcode didn't scan sometimes as well. You know, so it didn't count as a sale.
I don't know anything about that. All I know for certain is that the Country House came out in certainly 2, maybe 3 different formats. That each and every one of those formats would count towards a chart sale, and that if you are a fan, a real hot super fan, you're going to buy every one of those formats.
Yeah.
That's what you're going to do. So straight away, one person is counting for 3 sales, whereas Oasis released it as a single format only. And I think had they played the same game, or had Blur, had it been one against one, Oasis would have, you know. But you know, we're into if the dog hadn't stopped for a piss, it would have won the race. You know,
Exactly.
you know.
Another thing I want to touch on, you mentioned that your favourite time with Oasis was when like there was building up to bigger things. Is it more an enjoyable time in a band chasing the fame and the heights than it is actually being there?
I mean, I think so. I mean, you got to remember that I've never been a rock and roll star. I've only ever been a rock and roll worker bee, and you get to hang around with rock and roll stars and you observe. Yeah, I think that the period where nothing is certain, but it's all moving in the right direction, where you know you're getting attention, where you're generating heat, where you're selling more tickets, where the venues are getting bigger, but we're not into arena territory. You know, we're going from club to theatre, and then theatre to slightly bigger theatre. That point, because everything's fresh and new and exciting and interesting. And I come back to, you know, press and promotion. Press and promotion becomes a job. It becomes work. Shooting a video becomes a pain in the ass, becomes work, right? A lot of hanging around, you know, hurry up and wait. But in those early days, the bands are more than happy to be doing it, because it is all new and they haven't been spoiled. As human beings, they haven't been spoiled. So yeah, I suspect that a lot of bands would look back at their own trajectory, a U2, an REM, a Bruce Springsteen, and go, those were the moments, those were the days, you know, those were the days.
I know you'd rather people read the story for themselves because it is an interesting story, but what can you tell us about how your time ended with the band and how you felt at that time?
Liam and I increasingly were struggling to get on the road, and in part that was because, in my opinion, rightly or wrongly, and I don't suggest for a second that I was right, but in my opinion, you know, his behavior was damaging that joy that had developed. The fallings out with Noel, the fallings out with Bonehead, the fallings out with Griggsy, the fallings out with Alan. You know, there was nobody that escaped if Liam was kicking off. We're creating some really challenging atmospheres in and around the band, you know, at the very center of things. And I think I took the whole side in most instances, because I felt that Noel was right in most instances. That then created a significant chasm between Liam and I, and it just got wider. It came to a head in Paris, and I will not tell the whole story. I'll tell you enough. I mean, basically, it came to a head with Liam chucking a couple of punches at me successfully, and me lifting him up from the middle of a street, carrying him off the road, and bouncing him off a bus stop. And that was my final moment with Oasis.
And Griggsy left around the same time as well, didn't he?
Griggsy had a breakdown, and because he'd been a part of arriving at that place, Liam throwing punches, blah blah blah. That was the end of a story. That was the end of an evening, you know. And in that evening, Liam had kind of had a pop at Griggsy as well, and at Alan, not for the first time. And so yeah, Griggsy had something of a breakdown. It wasn't just what Liam had said or done. It was also the pressure of the workload that was then. It was off the scale. It really was. You know, I mean, the gigs were coming thick and fast, and you know, you'd finish a gig, you'd go out to a club, you'd get home at 3-4 o'clock in the morning, and at 5 o'clock somebody had to do an interview with Japan or with Australia. and of course that creates an immense pressure. So it was a lot of things, but that was the straw that kind of broke the camel's back. And so yeah, after that Parisian weekend of press, Squigsy disappeared, and but he didn't leave the band. He came back. He left.
Yeah.
Left the
Took
band.
a break. Yeah,
he took a break because he was broken. He was broken.
So after Oasis, what did you get up to, and what are you up to nowadays? What's your life like?
After Oasis, I think I went out and I did some work with a lot of blues bands. Actually, that was the period when I ended up looking after the likes of B.B. King and John Lee Hooker and Albert Collins, which was a great joy for me. Actually, did some stuff with. I did a lot of stuff with Bananarama over the years, some stuff with Mark Almond. So bits and bobs, but very shortly after that, I became a father, and I realized that I was of the opinion that it'd be very difficult to be a dad, full-time proper dad, and also to be, road filth. And so I kind of quit the music business altogether. I went and joined the Fire and Rescue Service. So I ended up in Fire and Rescue, retired 2019-20 as a watch commander. So I had my own fire station. And these days I look after an artist called Alex Lipinski. I'm going to pitch him again. He's great. Listen to him. You'll love it. I will tour manage from time to time. Like I said, I did that little side hustle with Mark Almond recently. I did some stuff with Neil X. I'm out with Neil X this weekend at a festival. And I work at an alcohol rehabilitation unit. I hasten to point out I work there. Okay, I'm not. They let me out at the end of the day, but I just do kind of like three days a week. So yeah, still busy, and importantly, still a fan. Okay, check out Jason Molina. Check out the Magnolia Electric Club. Check out the Joy Hotel. There's 3 tips for you, Ethan.
Yeah, I'll definitely check them out. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, buy the book because it is a brilliant book. I'm not just saying it because I'm speaking to Ian, but it is honestly a brilliant book. Not even just for Oasis fans, but music fans in general.
It's a book about being on the road, and it says Oasis on the cover, but frankly, it could say anything. It ain't all that different. Being on the road with a rock and roll band when they're having it, it's very, very similar. And I'll tell you how similar. Bananarama, who I'd worked with, came across to, they were in Tokyo at the same time that we were, and the girls phoned me up and said, can we get on the guest list? I said, yeah, of course you can, So I put Bananarama on the guest list, right, at the Oasis gig at wherever the hell we were. And they came backstage, and then we all went clubbing, and I guess it was about 5 o'clock in the morning. Noel comes up to me at 5 o'clock in the morning, and please forgive the shit impression. Both Noel and the man at Manchester accent, but he's like, Robbo, for fuck's sake, get me out of here. Them girls are going to fucking kill me. So it's about touring with a rock and roll band. It is about touring with Oasis, and it's about the stuff that we did. But between the lines, that's what it's like with every rock and roll band that ever goes out, pretty much.
Yeah, definitely. You bet you've got some amazing memories of all those years. Not even just Oasis, but
it's a fun.
Right, thank you, Ian.
Thanks, Ethan. I'm glad we got it done.
Yeah, I am. I do really appreciate coming back on.
Absolute pleasure, mate. Good questions, and it was a pretty special time, and buy the book, don't buy the book. I hope you enjoy the stories, because there weren't many people there to watch them, and then of those people that were there, some of them don't remember.
Yeah. Nice one, Ian. Thank you.
Cheers, buddy.